It was a Tuesday morning in early 1962, and a 46-year-old Australian colonel was sitting across the desk from the most powerful military commander in Southeast Asia, telling him to his face that everything he was doing was wrong. Colonel Ted Serong had flown into Saigon with 30 hand-picked jungle warfare specialists, men whose average age was 35, men who had spent years hunting communist guerrillas through the swamps and forests of Malaya. He had studied the American operation for 6 weeks. He had toured the provinces. He had watched American advisors train Vietnamese soldiers, and what he had seen made his stomach turn. Serong looked at General Paul Harkins and delivered an assessment so blunt it should have echoed through every command center in the Pacific. Your strategic policy is passive and reactionary. You have not grasped the nature of this task. Harkins stared at the Australian. The room went cold, because no one spoke to a 4-star American general like that. No one from a country with more sheep than soldiers told the United States military how to fight a war. Serong's private diary entry from that meeting was even more direct. He wrote that the situation in Vietnam was worse than he had been led to believe, and worsening, that the government plan existed only on paper, that the enemy's plan was steadily developing, that General Harkins needed to understand the nature of his task before it was too late. Harkins did not want to hear it. The Pentagon did not want to hear it, and over the next 13 years, 58,000 Americans would pay the price for that refusal. But this story is not about one meeting. It is about what happened before that meeting and what happened after. It is about the jungles of Malaya, where Australians learned lessons in blood that the Americans would refuse to learn from briefing papers. It is about a doctrine forged in darkness that could have saved thousands of lives. And it is about the most bitter question of the entire Vietnam War. What happens when the right answer exists, when people are screaming it at you, and you choose not to listen? To understand why Ted Serong's warning carried the weight it did, and why ignoring it proved so catastrophic, you have to go back 12 years to a different jungle, a different war, and a classroom written in ambush and counter-ambush across the Malayan Peninsula. In June 1948, the British colony of Malaya erupted. The Malayan National Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Malayan Communist Party, launched an insurgency that would consume the country for 12 years. They attacked rubber plantations and tin mines. They derailed trains. They burned workers' houses. They assassinated officials and planters in the open daylight. And they retreated into a jungle so dense, so unforgiving, that the British Army initially had no idea how to follow them. The early British response was a disaster that would echo through the next 2 decades of Western military history. Newly arrived troops from England had never seen a tropical forest before. They conducted large-scale sweeps through terrain where visibility rarely exceeded 10 meters, crashing through undergrowth so loudly that guerrillas could hear them coming from half a kilometer away. Officers who had learned their trade on the North European plain tried to apply battalion-level tactics to an environment that rendered battalions meaningless. You could not coordinate the movement of 200 men through vegetation that prevented you from seeing 10 meters in any direction. You could not bring firepower to bear on an enemy you could not locate. You could not hold ground in a jungle that consumed every position the moment you abandoned it. The results were predictable. Enormous expenditure of men and material for almost no contact with the enemy. Patrol after patrol returning to base, having seen nothing, killed nothing, accomplished nothing, except exhausting themselves in conditions that punished every wasted movement. The jungle swallowed the patrols and spat them out dehydrated, demoralized, and no closer to defeating the insurgency. The Australians arrived into this failure. They came with their own history of fighting in jungles, earned against the Japanese in New Guinea during the Second World War, where they had learned the hard way that dense tropical terrain demanded a completely different kind of soldier. Not bigger units, smaller ones, not more firepower, more patience, not louder operations, silence. The Malayan emergency became Australia's postgraduate education in counterinsurgency warfare. For 12 years, Australian soldiers hunted communist guerrillas through some of the most demanding terrain on Earth. The Malayan jungle was a living wall of bamboo, hardwood, and creeping vine that closed around patrols like a fist. Visibility dropped to meters, heat pressed down like a physical weight, leeches attached to exposed skin within minutes. The air was so saturated with moisture that clothing never dried, wounds never healed cleanly, and metal rusted in days. In this environment, Australians learned lessons that could not be taught in any classroom. They learned to patrol in groups so small that conventional military doctrine would have considered them suicidal. They learned to move so quietly that the jungle itself did not know they were there. A footfall on dry leaves could carry hundreds of meters in still air. A snapped branch was a signal flare. An improperly secured piece of equipment clinking against a rifle stock could get an entire patrol killed. So they learned to eliminate every sound. They wrapped metal in cloth. They taped down loose straps. They placed each boot with the conscious precision of a man crossing a minefield, because in practical terms, that is exactly what they were doing. They learned to read broken branches and compressed leaves and disturbed soil the way other soldiers read maps. A bent blade of grass told them someone had passed this way. The angle of the bend indicated direction of travel. The degree of recovery told them how long ago. Displaced spider webs meant a human had pushed through vegetation within the last few hours, because spiders rebuild their webs on predictable schedules. These were not abstract tracking skills. These were life-and-death intelligence tools that no piece of American technology could replicate. They learned that the enemy was not a problem to be overwhelmed with force, but a puzzle to be solved with intelligence, patience, and precision. And they learned something that would prove devastatingly relevant to Vietnam. They learned that the population was the battlefield, not the terrain. The British commander, General Sir Gerald Templer, articulated it in a phrase that would become one of the most quoted statements in counterinsurgency history. The answer, he said, was not in pouring more soldiers into the jungle. It was in winning the hearts and minds of the Malayan people. The shooting side of the business was only 25% of the problem. The Australian military absorbed these lessons at cellular level. They did not just read about them in manuals, they lived them. Officers and senior NCOs who would later command units in Vietnam spent years in Malaya perfecting techniques that no classroom could teach. They understood in their bones that fighting an insurgency was fundamentally different from fighting a conventional war. That firepower was a tool, not a strategy. That killing the enemy meant nothing if you simultaneously created more enemies. That the patient, methodical work of separating guerrillas from the population they depended on was far more valuable than any body count. When the Malayan emergency ended in 1960, Australia possessed something extraordinarily rare: an entire generation of combat-tested officers and NCOs who understood counterinsurgency warfare from direct personal experience. They knew what worked, they knew what failed, and they knew why. Then Vietnam began. The United States military that arrived in Vietnam in the early 1960s carried a fundamentally different set of assumptions. American doctrine had been forged in the vast conventional battles of the Second World War and Korea. It was built on the premise that superior technology, superior firepower, and superior logistics would overwhelm any adversary. Find the enemy, fix them in position, destroy them with everything you had. This approach had crushed Nazi Germany. It had held the line in Korea. It had made America the most powerful military force the planet had ever seen. But it had never been tested against a guerrilla insurgency operating in triple canopy jungle on the opposite side of the world. The United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk acknowledged the problem with remarkable candor. At an ANZUS meeting in Canberra in May 1962, Rusk openly admitted that American armed forces knew little about jungle warfare. It was this admission that led to the Australian government's decision to send the AATTV, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, to Saigon. 30 men, led by Colonel Ted Serong, the most qualified jungle warfare experts Australia could assemble. Serong had commanded the Jungle Warfare Training Centre at Canungra in Queensland, the institution that had codified everything the Australian military learned in Malaya, and refined it into a training system so rigorous it changed every soldier who survived it. Canungra had been specifically established to preserve and consolidate the tactical lessons learned by Allied troops in New Guinea and the Pacific during the Second World War. Under Serong's direction, from 1955 to 1957, the centre became the Australian Army's most important training institution at the company level. The courses at Canungra taught automatic responses and contact drills covering every situation a soldier might encounter in close jungle. They emphasized instinctive shooting, where a soldier could identify a target and fire accurately in the fraction of a second before the target disappeared behind vegetation. They drilled silent patrolling until it was not a skill but a reflex. They pushed physical conditioning to breaking point and then pushed further, because the jungle did not care about peacetime fitness standards, and they practiced something Serong called battle inoculation, the process of getting soldiers so accustomed to the stress of close combat, the noise, the confusion, the terror of bullets passing close enough to feel their heat, that their training took over when conscious thinking became impossible. Men who graduated Canungra did not think their way through contacts. They reacted, and those reactions had been forged through repetition so intense that they became as natural as breathing. The CIA station in Rangoon had actually noted the suitability of Serong's training methods for Vietnam as early as 1961, before Australia had even made a decision to provide military assistance to South Vietnam. The Americans knew these methods existed. They knew they were effective. And still, when Serong arrived in Saigon with his team, the institutional response was polite disinterest. These skills underpinned the Australian Army's entire method of jungle warfare, dispersed patrolling in small groups, moving quietly through vegetation rather than smashing through it, reading the jungle rather than fighting it. The approach had been developed fighting the Japanese, refined in Malaya, and by 1962 it represented a body of practical knowledge about counterinsurgency that arguably no other Western military possessed. Serong brought this knowledge to Saigon, and almost immediately he found himself in conflict with the American command structure. The problem was not personality, though Serong was known as a difficult subordinate with a profound conviction in his own judgment and a highly independent streak. The man had a way of making superiors uncomfortable. He spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent years watching his methods keep soldiers alive and watching other methods get them killed. He did not soften his assessments. He did not dress them in diplomatic language. When he saw failure being manufactured by institutional arrogance, he said so, and he said so in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. His first reconnaissance tours of South Vietnam in May 1962, undertaken before the AATTV even deployed, produced observations that should have set alarm bells ringing across the Pacific Command. Under the heading General Situation in his diary, he recorded a litany of concern. The government's plan existed only on paper. The Viet Cong's plan was steadily developing. The strategic policy was passive and reactionary. He wrote these words not as abstract analysis, but as a field assessment from a man who had spent years fighting exactly this kind of war and could recognize the early symptoms of catastrophic failure. The problem was doctrinal. The Americans were applying conventional warfare principles to an unconventional conflict. They were training South Vietnamese soldiers in tactics designed for the plains of Europe, not the jungles of Indochina. They were emphasizing large unit operations, massive firepower, and rapid deployment by helicopter. They were measuring success by the only metric that conventional warfare understood. How many enemy did you eliminate? Serong recognized this immediately. His diary entries from those early months read like a mounting catalog of alarm. He saw that the strategic policy was reactive, always responding to the enemy's initiative rather than seizing it. He saw that there was no unified control, no coherent strategy connecting military operations to political objectives. He saw that the American advisory effort was teaching the wrong lessons to soldiers who were fighting the wrong kind of war. And he said so, repeatedly, to anyone who would listen, and to many who would not. General Harkins, the commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, did not believe in counterinsurgency. That was not an exaggeration or a simplification. The man responsible for the American military effort in Vietnam did not accept the fundamental premise that this war required different methods than the wars America had won before. When the American government required other nations' troops to be present in Vietnam as a show of support, Harkins did not want other nations' commanders in his executive councils. He especially did not want an Australian colonel telling him that his approach was producing failure. Major General Charles Timms, the head of the Military Assistance Advisory Group, told Serong directly in mid-1963 that Harkins did not want the Australian team acting as initiators of policy. The message was unmistakable. Your expertise is noted. Your advice is unwanted. Stay in your lane. But Serong could not stay in his lane, not when he could see what was coming. He produced a steady stream of reports for Harkins throughout 1962 and 1963, a draft code of conduct for advisors, advice on broadening intelligence sources, analysis of enemy capabilities and intentions, notes on the critical deficiencies in South Vietnamese Army training. Each report was received, noted, and effectively discarded. The American machine continued operating according to its own assumptions, generating its own metrics of success, telling itself a story about progress that bore increasingly little relation to what was happening on the ground. Serong was not the only voice warning that the American approach was failing. Sir Robert Thompson, The British counterinsurgency expert who had been instrumental in the success of the Malayan campaign was also in Vietnam as head of the British advisory mission. Thompson had arrived in 1961 and had been pushing many of the same arguments Serong was making. Focus on the population. Emphasize police and intelligence work over military sweeps. Separate the guerrillas from their support base through methodical, patient operations rather than trying to destroy them with firepower. Thompson's advice was also largely ignored. The Americans acknowledged it politely and continued doing what they were doing. Years later, Thompson would publicly state that the Americans were failing because they refused to apply the lessons that had been proven successful in Malaya. They were fighting the wrong war with the wrong methods, and they were losing. But by the time anyone in a position of authority was willing to listen, tens of thousands of Americans had already come home in aluminum boxes. The Australian experience only deepened the frustration. When the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment arrived in 1965 and was attached to the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade, the differences in tactical philosophy became immediately and painfully apparent. The Airborne Brigade was designed for large deployments and heavy firepower. The Australians, with their counterinsurgency experience operating independently in small units, were unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable with these tactics. The clash was not subtle. American doctrine called for rapid deployment by helicopter, insertion into a contested zone, aggressive movement to contact, and then the application of overwhelming firepower. It was dramatic. It was decisive-looking, and in the jungles of Vietnam, it was frequently a recipe for disaster. Helicopter insertions announced the arrival of patrols to every enemy position within kilometers. The distinctive sound of Huey rotors carried across the flat, still air of the Mekong Delta, and reverberated off the hills of the Central Highlands. By the time American boots hit the ground, the enemy already knew where they were, how many there were, and roughly which direction they would move. The Australians were used to walking in, not from a few hundred meters away, from kilometers away. They were used to spending hours crossing relatively short distances because every step was a considered decision. They were used to arriving at their objective position already invisible, already integrated into the environment, already aware of what the enemy was doing. Being inserted by helicopter into a hot landing zone felt to them like jumping into a swimming pool and expecting the water not to notice. The Australian policy of economy of effort was directly opposed to the American idea of concentration of force. Where Americans massed troops and poured fire into suspected enemy positions, Australians used small patrols to find the enemy first, then applied precise, targeted force. Where Americans measured success by how many enemy they eliminated, Australian battalion commanders held the body count metric in open contempt. Where Americans conducted large, sweep and clear operations that pushed the enemy temporarily out of an area before they filtered back in, Australians conducted endless patrols, laid ambushes, and systematically pressured the enemy's ability to operate. One journalist who accompanied Australian patrols described the experience as extraordinarily frustrating. Patrols took as much as 9 hours to cover a single mile of terrain. They moved forward a few steps at a time, stopped, listened, and then proceeded again. It was the antithesis of American urgency, and it was devastatingly effective. The differences came to a head when the Australians established their own area of operations. In April 1966, the 1st Australian Task Force was established in Phuoc Tuy Province, based at Nui Dat. This was not a random assignment. The Australians had specifically argued for and received their own province, precisely because the differences between Australian and American methods had made combined operations difficult. The arrangement allowed the Australian Army to fight its own tactical war, independently of the United States. It was, in effect, a quiet acknowledgment that two Allied forces fighting the same enemy in the same country could not agree on how to fight, and the results spoke in the starkest possible terms. General William Westmoreland, the commander who replaced Harkins, continued the American approach on a vastly larger scale. His strategy of attrition was built on a breathtakingly simple premise. If he could kill enough of the enemy, they would lose heart and stop fighting. To achieve this, he conducted massive search and destroy operations using hundreds of thousands of troops supported by artillery, airstrikes, and helicopter assault. He poured 500,000 Americans into Vietnam. He dropped more bombs than had been dropped in all of the Second World War combined. He inflicted staggering casualties on the enemy, and it did not work. The enemy did not lose heart. They did not stop fighting. They simply sent more replacements to make up their losses. Westmoreland was on a treadmill, running harder and harder while the destination receded into the distance. His body count metrics, the numbers he reported to Washington with such confidence, were meaningless because all the enemy's losses were quickly replaced. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong proved willing to absorb horrifying casualties and keep fighting, not because they did not value life, but because they were fighting for something they valued more than survival. The search and destroy operations Westmoreland favored typically employed a series of large unit sweeps conducted in deep jungle regions along South Vietnam's western borders. These operations were designed to seek out enemy forces and engage them in decisive battle, but they accomplished nothing lasting. American units would sweep through an area, make contact, call in massive firepower, claim victory, and leave. The enemy would filter back within days. The villages remained contested. The infrastructure remained intact. The population remained caught between two forces, neither of which was providing them with lasting security. Meanwhile, Army Chief of Staff General Harold K. Johnson put forward an alternative approach in the PROVN study, a program for the pacification and long-term development of Vietnam. That document argued that Westmoreland's approach was not working, and could not work because it ignored the real war in South Vietnam's hamlets and villages, where the enemy's covert infrastructure was using coercion and terror to dominate the rural population. Johnson's study echoed almost exactly what the Australians had been demonstrating in Phuoc Tuy. It was largely ignored, and it did not work. The enemy did not lose heart. They did not stop fighting. They simply sent more replacements. As war journalist Stanley Carno observed, Westmoreland did not understand that there was no breaking point. Instead of breaking their morale, the Americans were breaking their own. Westmoreland visited the Australian task force in January 1967. His assessment of their methods was damning. He called them very inactive. He complained to the Australian commander, Major General Tim Vincent, that they were not being aggressive enough. This was the fundamental disconnect laid bare. The most senior American commander in Vietnam looked at the Australian approach, an approach born from 12 years of successful counterinsurgency in Malaya and refined through years of additional jungle warfare experience, and judged it as insufficiently aggressive. He wanted more sweeps, more firepower, more body count, more of everything that was already not working. The Australians had a different word for what Westmoreland called inactivity. They called it winning. In Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australians were implementing exactly the methodology that Serong had been advocating since 1962. Constant patrolling, small unit ambushes, systematic pressure on the enemy's ability to move, communicate, and operate among the population. Patient, grinding, unglamorous work that produced no spectacular victories and no headlines, but steadily and demonstrably reduced the enemy's capacity to fight. The Special Air Service Regiment operated as the eyes and ears of the task force. Small patrols of 5 men moved through the jungle with a discipline that stunned American observers. They operated on missions lasting days or weeks, moving so slowly and so silently that the jungle soundscape remained undisturbed. Birds continued singing. Insects continued calling. There was nothing for enemy listening posts to detect. The SAS had been modeled on the British SAS and shared their motto, "Who dares wins." But what the Australians dared was not what most people imagined when they thought of special forces. They dared to be patient when every instinct demanded action. They dared to be silent when noise would have been easier. They dared to be invisible when visibility might have felt safer. A typical SAS patrol would be inserted by helicopter, usually into a landing zone some distance from their actual area of operations. Once on the ground, they would move away from the insertion point, using a technique that left no trail. They stepped on roots and rocks rather than soft earth. They avoided disturbing vegetation where possible. When crossing muddy ground, the last man would brush out tracks behind the patrol. Then the real work began. Movement rates that American observers found almost incomprehensible. A few steps, then freezing in place for minutes at a time. During those frozen intervals, the patrol was not resting. They were working harder than any soldier sprinting through the bush, eyes scanning in every direction without moving the head, ears processing every sound the jungle produced, filtering the normal from the abnormal, the natural from the human, nostrils testing the air for traces of cooking fire, tobacco, the distinct smell of Nuoch Mam fish sauce that could indicate a nearby Viet Cong position. When they found the enemy, they did not rush to engage. They observed, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. They counted fighters and mapped positions. They noted weapon types and ammunition stores. They identified command structures and communication patterns. They gathered intelligence so detailed, so precise, that when action finally came, whether through ambush or artillery, it was delivered with surgical accuracy. The ambushes themselves were textbook examples of patient violence. A patrol might spend an entire day setting up a single killing ground. Claymore mines positioned with exact fields of fire. Individual fighting positions selected for maximum concealment and interlocking arcs. Everything prepared, everything checked, everything waited for. And then silence. Hours of silence. Until the enemy walked into a space where escape was impossible, and the first detonation ended the engagement before it began. Some ambushes lasted 4 seconds. 3 enemy dead. 0 shots fired that could be heard beyond a 50-meter radius. 0 Australian casualties. And then the patrol would remain in position, motionless, watching the trail for hours more, gathering intelligence on the enemy's response. Over the course of 6 years in Vietnam, the Australian SAS conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols. Their casualties were remarkably low: 1 killed in action, 1 dead from wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded. Their own losses totaled just over 30 men from a force of roughly 580 who served in Vietnam. The enemy losses they inflicted told the other half of the story. The SAS achieved the highest kill ratio of any Australian unit in the war. Across the entire Australian force, total losses in Vietnam were 521 dead and approximately 3,000 wounded, from a total commitment of almost 60,000 personnel over 10 years. In Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australian approach arguably achieved something American methods never managed anywhere in Vietnam: the restoration of South Vietnamese government control over the province. But the most powerful testament to Australian effectiveness came from the enemy themselves. A former female Viet Cong member stated it with brutal clarity in a later documentary. They were not afraid of the American GIs Australian infantry or even B-52 bombing. What they hated was the Australian SAS Rangers, because the SAS made their comrades disappear. The Viet Cong developed entirely different tactical guidance for engaging Australian forces compared to Americans. Against Americans, the guidance emphasized predictable patterns. American helicopter insertions created detectable noise signatures from kilometers away. American patrols moved at trackable speeds. American doctrine favored immediate escalation to heavy supporting fires, which created exploitable patterns that allowed ambush teams to withdraw before effective retaliation. Against Australians, the guidance was radically different: avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Australian patrols were acknowledged as extremely difficult to detect, to track, to ambush. Their movement patterns were unpredictable. Their patience exceeded anything other Western forces had demonstrated. The operational impact was measurable. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy Province was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. When they did enter, their behavior changed completely, becoming defensive and cautious rather than offensive and aggressive. This was not because the Australians were in less strategically important areas. This was not because they were avoiding contact. Captured enemy documents eliminated every alternative explanation. The enemy was explicitly instructing its forces to avoid Australian contact because Australians were more dangerous. The Viet Cong were choosing their fights. Against Americans, they had advantages. Against Australians, they did not. The Australian AATTV, the team Serong had built, continued operating throughout the war, expanding from its original 30 men to a peak strength of 227 advisors by 1970. They worked with South Vietnamese Army units, Special Forces teams, and Montagnard tribesmen. They earned 4 Victoria Crosses, Australia's highest award for valor, more than any other Australian unit in Vietnam. The methods they taught, the small unit jungle warfare techniques Serong had pioneered at Canungra, proved themselves in action again and again. Yet the institutional resistance to their lessons never abated. The American military machine was simply too large, too committed to its existing doctrine, and too invested in its own metrics of success to absorb fundamental criticism from an ally fielding fewer than 8,000 troops at peak strength. Westmoreland himself offered a revealing paradox. While criticizing the Australians as inactive, he also described them in his memoir as the most thoroughly professional foreign force serving in Vietnam. He compared them to the post-Versailles German army, in which even men in the ranks might have been leaders in some less capable force. He could recognize Australian quality. He could see individual excellence when it stood in front of him. He simply could not accept that Australian methods were superior to his own. The cognitive dissonance was extraordinary. Here was a general praising the soldiers while dismissing the doctrine that made those soldiers effective. It was like admiring the sharpness of a surgeon's scalpel while insisting that surgery should be performed with a sledgehammer. The irony cut deeper still. Australian SAS instructors were actually teaching American soldiers the techniques that American generals refused to adopt at the institutional level. The MACV Recondo School, which trained American long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel, used Australian SAS instructors. The Australians provided instructors to the LRRP training wing at the AATTV, operated Van Keep Training Center, teaching Americans the very techniques their senior commanders dismissed as insufficient. Individual Americans at the tactical level recognized the value. They sought out Australian expertise. They adapted Australian methods for their own small unit patrols. It was the institutional level, the level where strategy was made and doctrine was written, that refused to learn. The cost of that refusal was measured in American lives. Westmoreland's war of attrition consumed over 4 years of American public support. His search and destroy tactics did nothing to address the war in the hamlets and villages where the enemy's real infrastructure operated. He underestimated the enemy's staying power, maintaining that sufficient casualties would break their will, while the enemy proved willing to absorb horrifying losses and keep fighting. He denied senior civilian officials accurate data on enemy strength. He was, as one analysis put it, on a treadmill, running faster and faster while going nowhere. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 shattered the illusion of progress that Westmoreland had been constructing for years. The enemy attacked simultaneously across the entire country, striking targets in cities and towns that were supposed to be secure. Viet Cong fighters penetrated the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon. They seized the ancient imperial capital of Hue and held it for weeks. They struck at every major city, every provincial capital, every assumption that the war was being won. The offensive was a military defeat for the Communists, who suffered enormous casualties in conventional fighting they were not designed for. But it was a strategic catastrophe for the United States because it proved that 4 years of attrition strategy, 4 years of search and destroy, 4 years of body counts and massive firepower had not broken the enemy's capacity or will to fight. The American public, which had been told repeatedly that progress was being made, watched enemy fighters running through the streets of Saigon on their television screens and understood viscerally that they had been lied to. Westmoreland's response to Tet was to request 206,000 additional troops. His answer to the failure of overwhelming force was more overwhelming force. The request was denied. Public support for the war collapsed. President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The war entered its long, agonizing descent toward an outcome that Serong had foreseen in 1962, and Thompson had predicted from his first assessment of American strategy. In Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australians experienced Tet differently. The enemy attacked the provincial capital, Baria, and several other positions, but the Australian task force had been patrolling so aggressively, had gathered such detailed intelligence on enemy movements, and had so thoroughly disrupted Viet Cong operations in the province that the attacks were far less effective than elsewhere. The difference was not luck. It was method. The patient, grinding, intelligence-driven approach that Westmoreland had called inactive had produced exactly the kind of security that his search and destroy operations had promised but never delivered. Serong had seen this coming in 1962. Thompson had seen it coming. The Australians had been demonstrating an alternative approach since 1966. The evidence was available to anyone willing to examine it, but institutions do not change because evidence demands change. They change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. And by the time the American military establishment recognized the magnitude of its failure, the war was effectively lost. The tragedy deepened after the war. When the United States military finally began serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, the reforms incorporated principles the Australians had demonstrated effective decades earlier. Emphasis on small unit tactics and individual operator judgment, prioritization of stealth and patience over firepower and aggression, understanding that cultural adaptation and environmental integration could achieve results technology alone could not deliver. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the entire modern apparatus of American unconventional warfare, all of it incorporated lessons that were available for learning in 1962. The MACV Recondo School, which trained American long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel, actually used Australian SAS instructors. The Australians provided instructors to the LRRP training wing, teaching Americans the very techniques their senior commanders dismissed as insufficient. Individual Americans at the tactical level recognized the value. It was the institutional level that refused to learn. Serong himself left the Australian Army in 1968, but remained in Vietnam as a security and intelligence advisor, working for the Rand Corporation, the Hudson Institute, and consulting to the Pentagon and 3 American presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. He later served as a security and intelligence advisor to the South Vietnamese government itself, continuing to offer strategic analysis to anyone who would listen, continuing to advocate for the counterinsurgency approach he had been pushing since the beginning. He stayed until the very end, not as a bureaucrat serving out a posting, but as a man who believed with every fiber of his being that the war could still be won if the right methods were applied. He was convinced, right up until the final months, that he had identified the best tactical methods for the South Vietnamese Army to employ in the last battles of the war. Those ideas were offered freely. They were met, in many cases, with open hostility. By 1975, the man who had once advised 3 American presidents was shouting into a void. On April 29, 1975, as North Vietnamese tanks rolled toward Saigon and the last helicopters lifted off from the American embassy roof, Ted Serong was aboard one of them. He had arrived in Vietnam in 1962, warning that the American approach would fail. 13 years later, he watched that prediction fulfilled from the air as the country he had tried to save disappeared beneath him. The fall of Saigon was not just a military defeat. It was the final, irrevocable confirmation of everything Serong and the Australian military had been saying since the day they arrived. The lessons of this story are not comfortable ones, and they are not confined to history. The fundamental pattern repeats in conflict after conflict. A powerful military force enters a complex operational environment carrying assumptions developed in different wars against different enemies. Those assumptions produce methods that feel natural and look decisive, but do not match the actual problem. Allies and advisors with directly relevant experience identify the mismatch and offer alternatives. The powerful force, invested in its own doctrine and uncomfortable with the implication that its methods are wrong, rejects the alternatives. The cost of that rejection is paid in lives. The Australians in Vietnam were not perfect. Their methods carried their own costs, psychological and moral, that no statistical analysis adequately captured. The men who learned to hunt other men through the jungle did not simply switch back to normal when their tours ended. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually exceed those of their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer casualties. The transformation that made them effective operators made them strangers in their own communities. They had learned to think like predators, and predators do not easily return to civilian life. Phuoc Tuy Province itself is a study in imperfect success. The Australians largely controlled the province during their presence, but when they withdrew, the security situation deteriorated. The pacification work was real, but it depended on continuous effort that could not simply be handed off. No counterinsurgency success is permanent if it is not sustained, and the ethical dimensions were not uncomplicated. Some Australian practices, particularly certain aspects of psychological warfare and the treatment of enemy dead, occupied gray zones that looked problematic in peacetime review. The classified annex of the final American assessment of Australian operations noted that certain Australian practices would likely have violated standing American directives if conducted by U.S. personnel. Effectiveness and morality do not always align perfectly, and any honest assessment of the Australian experience must acknowledge that tension. But none of this diminishes the central, damning truth of the story. The right approach to the Vietnam War existed. It was demonstrated, it was offered, and it was refused. Ted Serong sat across from General Harkins in 1962 and told him the truth. The Australians deployed to Phuoc Tuy in 1966 and proved it on the ground. The AATTV advisors taught it to anyone who would learn. The SAS demonstrated it in every patrol they conducted. You are going to get people killed. That was the warning, stated in different words at different times by different Australians to different Americans across 13 years of war. It was stated through reports that were filed and forgotten, through briefings that were politely received and quietly discarded, through operational results that were classified because they embarrassed the institutions that should have been studying them, through the stark comparison of casualty rates that told anyone who cared to look which approach was working and which was failing. The American military of the 1960s was not stupid. It was not staffed by fools. It contained brilliant officers, dedicated soldiers, and genuine expertise in warfare as they understood it. What it lacked was the institutional humility to recognize that its understanding of warfare was not universal, that the lessons of Normandy and Incheon did not automatically apply to the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands, that an ally with 12 years of directly relevant counterinsurgency experience might know things that a superpower with unmatched conventional capability did not. Westmoreland himself is perhaps the best example of this paradox, a man described by admirers as the very image of a general with a firm jaw, ramrod bearing, and unshakable confidence. A man who had served with distinction in the Second World War and Korea. A man who was named Times Man of the Year. And a man who, by the assessment of military historians, lacked the schooling and relevant experience to understand the war he was fighting. He had never attended the Army's Command and General Staff College or the War College. He was an artilleryman commanding a counterinsurgency, and he dismissed the advice of people who had spent their careers studying and practicing exactly the kind of warfare he was now losing. The Australian soldiers who served in Vietnam came home to a country that, like America, was deeply divided over the war. Many received poor treatment from a public that conflated opposition to the war with hostility toward those who fought it. Their contributions were under-recognized for decades. The lessons they had demonstrated were credited to later American innovations rather than to the Australians who pioneered them. Colonel Serong, the man who had warned Harkins in 1962, who had warned Kennedy's special group, who had remained in Vietnam as an advisor for 13 years, trying to salvage something from a strategy he knew was failing, was considered one of the world's foremost authorities on counterinsurgency warfare by the time of his death in 2002. His techniques, refined at Canungra and validated in Malaya and Vietnam, influenced military training and doctrine for decades. Yet his name remains largely unknown outside specialist military circles. The institutions that ignored him eventually, grudgingly, adopted the principles he advocated, but they did so decades too late for the men and women whose names are etched on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. 58,318 names, the names of people whose country possessed allies willing to share hard-won knowledge about how to fight and survive in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Knowledge that was offered freely and refused consistently. You are going to get people killed. The warning was given. The evidence was provided. The alternative was demonstrated. The institutions chose not to listen. 50 years later, the pattern persists. New wars produce new versions of the same fundamental confrontation. Technological overconfidence meeting environmental reality. Institutional assumptions colliding with conditions those assumptions cannot address. The expensive way failing, while the simple way succeeds. New Serongs sit across desks from new commanders, delivering assessments that no one in authority wants to hear. The only question that matters is whether the institutions have learned to listen. Ted Serong answered that question in 1962 from a desk in Saigon. The Australian SAS answered it from the jungles of Phuoc Tuy. The captured enemy documents answered it in language that could not be misinterpreted. The casualty lists answered it in numbers that could not be argued away. The institutions that ignored them are still formulating their response.